webinar. I know that voice. Okay, colleagues, shall we begin? Great. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this dialogue. My name is David Covo. I'm an associate professor in the Peter Guahua Fu School of Architecture at McGill University, and I am an architect. I'm also a member of the organizing committee of ICCCASU 4 and will be moderating this session with my colleague, Denise Piché. Denise, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. I'm Denise Piché, and I'm a professor of an associate professor of architecture at the School of Architecture at Laval University in Quebec City.
Thanks, Denise. I'll say a few words about the format, and then we'll get into the presentations. I wanted to start by reminding everyone that this is a plenary panel. It's the first of two dialogues that launch this second day of the conference. Denise and I want you to know that these dialogues have been designed as opportunities for a group of invited experts, you see them in front of you, to share their knowledge and experience, but also their own personal perspectives on what we've identified as a key theme of the conference. In this case, rethinking the post-pandemic city. We also want you to see the dialogue as a forum for what we hope will be an energizing and productive conversation with the audience following the presentations. So welcome to the first of these two dialogues. Here briefly is the format. Denise and I are going to introduce the panelists. We'll do that in 2 or 3 minutes, and we'll move directly into the presentations. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes. Following the presentations, we're going to open the discussion up to interventions from the audience. And we use the term interventions here as opposed to questions, because we're going to be encouraging members of the audience to share their own experiences and reflections on the notion of rethinking the post-pandemic city. Finally, we will close with a 5 or 6 minute wrap up at the end of the session, within which each speaker will have an opportunity to make a final comment, share a conclusion, perhaps a reflection. So Denise, I think we can get going. Would you like to introduce the first two speakers?
Yes, the speaker will launch our conversation is Mary Rowe. She's president and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute, a national platform for the promotion of inspired city building that connects city builders, such as policymakers, urban professionals, civic and business leaders, community activists, and academics through initiatives based on programs, partnership, research, and community engagement. She is a leading urban advocate and civil society who has worked across Canada and the USA. And she's a frequent contributor to national and international city building programs such as UN Habitat and the World Urban Forum. Now I'll switch to French to introduce the second speaker. René Joly-Asako est professeur titulaire de géographie et vice-recteur chargé des enseignements et du développement d'éthique à l'Université Douala au Cameroun. Il est docteur de l'Université Paris 10 à Nanterre. Il a publié plusieurs articles et ouvrages et reçu d'importantes distinctions pour sa contribution à la vie et au développement universitaire. Véritable leader dans la recherche urbaine africaine, il a créé et anime le réseau africain de recherche en urbanisation, RUBA-Afrique, qui fédère 8 équipes dans 6 pays, dont 5 en Afrique. As a short summary, René Joly-Asako is a full professor of geography at Douala University, and he's also the vice principal for academic affairs and development of ITC at his university. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Denise. I'll start by introducing Vikram Bhatt, one of my oldest friends and colleagues. We've known each other for well over 40 years. Vikram studied architecture in India and completed his graduate studies in housing at McGill, where he also taught for more than 40 years until his retirement a couple of years ago. As director of the graduate program in minimum cost housing for 30 years, he managed teaching and research programs that addressed shelter and human settlements, housing in the developing world, urban agriculture, and housing and habitat planning in northern Quebec. Recent recognition of his work includes the 2014 Margulies Prize and appointments as fellow to both the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada and most recently the Royal Society of Canada. I'll say a few words about my friend and colleague, John Zacharias, as well. John, who will be closing the presentation, started his own teaching career during his doctoral studies at the Faculté de l'Aménagement at the Université de Montréal. He moved to Concordia University in 1990, and for the next 2 decades, taught urban studies and urban planning. In 2012, he relocated to China, to Beijing, to take up his position as a chair professor in the College of Architecture and Landscape at Peking University, Beida, where he has been teaching and leading research on urban development in China. A former vice president of ICCCASU, he's been involved with this organization since the first conference in Yaoundé, Cameroon in 2015. I think we can move directly into the presentations at this point. Mary, are you ready?
I'm all set. Hello.
Hey.
I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues from various Canadian universities and also around the world. I lead something called the Institut Urbain des Canadiens, and I am very pleased to have a chance to be with academic colleagues who are struggling with the same kinds of issues that we live with practically, I would say. And through COVID, so much has been exacerbated by so much of what urban life is like. The good and the bad and the ugly has been made gooder, badder, and uglier through the pandemic. So I'm going to share my screen, she says, hopefully, and I'm going to just run through for you what my sort of observations have been, or what our observations have been here. You win the award for one of the longest acronyms I've ever seen, ICCCASU, and I'm interested in this, the way in which we're trying to foster knowledge, because what I always say about the Canadian Urban Institute is that we're in the connective tissue business, and trying to create horizontal peer-to-peer learning networks in a country that's actually organized for vertical relationships, not for horizontal relationships. So, and my brother in Quebec will confirm this, that we have a kind of constitutional bias that brings municipalities report, who then relate to provincial governments, who then relate to the federal government. And then you have a strange or a system in Canada that brings the provincial governments together with each other and with Canada, but and increasingly with Indigenous First Nations, but municipalities are almost absent from those decision-making tables. So part of what I've been trying to do during my tenure here at CUI is to make the point, Canada is one of the most urbanized countries in the world, and that we have this system and we need to move to this system somehow, because urbanism is fundamentally local, and challenges are experienced locally, and similarly solutions need to be incubated locally, which I think is what we've seen articulated again and again and again during COVID. The COVID crisis is predominantly an urban crisis, and that was true. I mean, yes, the virus proliferated and eventually reached smaller communities in rural areas, but it predominantly was incubated and hosted in urban environments. And as I suggested, Canada's a highly urban country. So, but when you look at the way the population is distributed in the country, and then where the cases occurred and where the deaths occurred, as I suggested, disproportionately urban. Excuse me. And part of that dynamic has to do with how our cities have been planned and constructed. So sadly, a lot of this lives with your predecessors in disciplines from which many of you come, in terms of how we've planned and designed urban environments, where we have what Jay Pitter is calling forgotten densities. So yes, densities are important, and they're important ecologically, and they're important economically, certainly, and they're important socially as well. But if you have dense urban environments where there aren't other kinds of amenities, where there are inadequate supports, and where the actual public realm has been disinvested in or not properly planned, then you have situations where you have people that can't protect themselves, they can't easily work from home, they can't socially distance, they didn't have access to the kinds of extra supports that in fact people required. And it just sort of underscored the disconnections we have between what people in community actually need and what the spatial environment can provide them. And then when you need to make changes, do you have the kind of democratic mechanisms or engagement mechanisms that ensure that whatever interventions you're taking are actually appropriate for that community and useful? My anecdote about this is, in terms of vaccination rollout, finally here in Toronto, they're doing vaccination rollout by knocking on people's doors in buildings, but that took them about 16 weeks to figure that out. And I would say that early on in the pandemic, if we had had the capacity to decentralize and to put resources and opportunity in people's hands, and if we had those networks, we probably do have those networks, but if we had resourced them and charged them with that kind of responsibility and the latitude to do what they needed to do, I think we could have potentially seen quite a different outcome in terms of what the actual impact of COVID was. Hopefully I'll advance. So one of the things that we saw early on, we issued reports every 100 days, COVID 100, COVID 200, COVID 300, and people can go online and see these things. And we were the early ones to say, look, folks, the incidence of COVID is racialized, and it is existing in lower income communities, which are often racialized. That there is a serious kind of reckoning that we all need to be doing about this. It's not a surprise to people in your disciplines, but the question would be, what do we have to do? What are these interventions that we have to do to be able to anticipate that vulnerable populations, once again, are going to be at the top of these kinds of statistical findings, which is discouraging to say the least. So we used to, people were saying at the beginning, oh, it's COVID is the great equalizer. Well, of course, it wasn't the great equalizer. And I've used this phrase before, that it was like a particle accelerator. I actually borrowed that from Eric Kleinenberg, who may be a colleague of many of yours at NYU, who's a sociologist, who used it as a term to describe what happened in Chicago after the fire in 1995 that killed people, but it killed people in certain neighborhoods and not in others. And he, despite FEMA determining that there was no real lesson learned there, Eric was a grad student and went into the data more detailed and figured out that actually the parts of the city where there was urban form that had enabled social connection and a kind of awareness of who lived where and where people, that the movements were a more connected movement, those folks fared much better than those that were in isolated situations. And I think, the post-COVID period is going to be critical for the academy to really unpack and pull apart the data points that we have to try to understand the extent to which we have to rethink completely how we go ahead and plan, program, design, resource these communities. We started something called citywatchcanada.ca, which was a tracking device that put up 65 municipalities and showed the measures that they were introducing each time, because they had no idea what each other was doing. And then we similarly put up something called citysharecanada.ca, which is a crowdsourced platform of community initiatives, because as we all know, mutual aid and various kinds of ground up resourcefulness started to emerge, everything from Facebook groups to buyer clubs to all sorts of things. And we wanted to find a way to be able to document that. And again, to see the extent to which that kind of rampant, urgent improvisation now needs to be, some of it needs to be normalized and made and being enabled and formalized potentially to build the resilience as we go forward. So I think the point here I wanted to make on potential was just that, the impact on individuals and the extent to which COVID constrained people to actually be able to have agency Well, they didn't have much agency. That's really the challenge. And so how do we imagine this going forward? Other kinds of threats coming towards us when we know that we need all hands on deck to mobilize responses. A highly centralized system doesn't do that. In terms of the actual impact on Canadian cities, I just put some statistics up so you could see. One of the focuses we have is something called Restore the Core. And the impact on downtowns is extraordinary. It's going to be long lasting. It's affected people's use of the downtowns. It's affected people's comfort in downtowns. And these are where economies are driven, but this is also where culture and live events thrive, and also where we see a lot of the sort of fundamentals of social cohesion are navigated and determined in downtown core environments. And if we don't have diverse populations there, and we don't have good transit service, and we don't have a good housing mix, and we don't have jobs, and the retail suffers as a result, you're dealing with, if any of you have spent any time talking to your colleagues in other cities, you're dealing with a potential kind of Mel Gibson-like dystopia that is starting to take hold in certain downtowns. And there's lots of serious questions to be addressed through that. So the other point that we are trying to make here is that the burden of COVID fell to municipal staff. They became the ultimate DIYers, the do-it-yourself cityers. They had to respond urgently in terms of homelessness, in terms of transit reconfiguration, in terms of public health supports, also in terms of economic supports, having to make a gazillion changes to try to make public spaces more accessible. Bike lanes fantastically came up very quickly. Patios, all the different ways in which we've seen the kind of emerging very rapid change to the built form, the urban fabric. And that burden has fallen to municipal staff. So we have a whole series of programs now around how do municipal staff peer-to-peer learn from one another, build their own capacity, because in lots of cases they weren't really equipped to do that. And also in Canada, municipalities lack money. They are beholden to their provinces and to transfer payments that come from provinces. They have some arrangements with federal governments, but few. All of that has to change because you can't have the unit of government that carries the burden of service so disempowered, both in terms of in terms of revenues and in terms of authority. So we have an ongoing conversation about what the future of urban Canada needs to look like. This is City Share. This platform that I indicated is a sort of ground source. This is a couple of months old because I think the examples are up to about 1,000 now, of these kinds of how do we harvest and collate all the smart ways in which communities have responded. So I think my last comment here would be, if we need to move Canada from this to this, we see it in the calls for racial justice. We see it in the calls for reconciliation and truth. And we need more and more informal, ad hoc kinds of arrangements of governance because opening the constitutional discourse is blood sport in Canada. And so I feel like we double down on focusing on the local, and we double down on thinking about what urban innovation looks like and how it comes from the ground up. And then how do we enable more and more of that? And I don't see us being able to move forward economically, socially, or environmentally if we don't train our lens to the granular and to granular solutions, and where the reality of urban life is for 80% of Canadians. Thanks very much.
Wow! Thank you very much, Mary. That was a very compelling and I think a very provocative introduction to this session. I'm looking forward to an active Q&A, but we'll come to that shortly. Vikram, are you ready to?
Yes, I am. If you could ask Mary to.
Great, thank you very much.
Michelle, could you put the title?
Okay, thanks, Vikram. You have the floor.
Could you ask Michelle to just put up the screen share also?
Yes, she'll be doing that.
Good morning. Can you just put the title slide on? Okay, thanks very much.
Great.
Okay. Thinking ahead in our dialogue about how post-pandemic the cities will be shaped and influenced, what I've chosen to do is look back a little. The reason I would like to take a little longer look is to ask the question how thinkers, designers, decision makers are influenced, and they will be continually influenced in their thinking. And I would say that the foundations of the modern cities, which were laid by the modernists that shaped our city, will continue to shape our cities post-pandemic. And let me explain. Early modernist urban reform managed to control land use and zoning by classifying human activity in three domains: dwelling, work, and leisure, connected by transportation. These three spheres will continue to appear and disappear in different disguises. Take, for example, ICCCASU's conference moniker, density, diversity, and mobility. It's exactly the same in a different disguise. With efficient automobile transport, they have impelled a very rapid framework of modernist total planning and design. These principles have and will continue to move us forward in the new post-pandemic city. Furthermore, international free market commerce, global finance platforms, and ever expanding value chains that deliver our commodities will continue to amplify this process. These processes leave, as Mary just observed, very little room for the grassroots innovation. We overlook the drive of ordinary people, communities, and use available resources, which are the aspiring and foundational powers of democracies, which create equitable cities. So how do we get over this was a great challenge. And again, what Mary just referred to is do it yourself, act as a community, help one another, carry us over the challenges in the most innovative way. That's what we're doing. In that process, what I decided next, to look back at the work that we have done, actions, what you can do with the city, is a research project that was initiated by the Canadian Centre for Architecture in 2007. Following that, there was an exhibition at the CCA in Montreal in 2008. The same exhibition traveled to the Graham Foundation in Chicago in 2009. And then Ex Biennale de Arquitectura, Sao Paulo in 2013. There was a publication also, which you see shown here on the left. I had contributed to these. And why I'm looking to it is what we had identified were 99 actions where local people, individuals, communities, and others who have initiated different ways to make their cities better. They serve, I think, as a springboard for imagining our city post-pandemic. The reason I say that is during and post-pandemic, dramatic changes which are taking place and will continue to take place will reshape our schools, our homes, our workplaces, our leisure. These three domains will continue to be somehow shaped. And it is the actions which we need to engage in this process, where individuals, families, communities, and others have a greater say and greater control. The actions that we had collected are classified in 4 broad categories: walking, playing, recycling, and gardening. They don't sound like anything related to what we would say how it's gonna reshape post-pandemic our cities. Next. It is putting aside the automobile, which allows us to control our negative space within which the city lives. Either we exist inside our bubble, which has protected us up to a point, and the city ceases to exist, or we as a community take hold of where we are. Actions: the modern transport aims at speed, efficiency, and mobility, whereas walking is opposite, rather slow, inefficient. But when we walk, we look at and appreciate our surroundings. Walking is reflective. It's a physical activity. Walking has carried me over. Walking has carried my grandchildren over. Walking has carried my neighbors over through this unprecedented phase. This is what we are still forgetting in thinking about of the new city. Walking like the pilgrims on a march to the shrine of St. James the Great. Their paths originate from various European cities, but in the process where people all come together today, not only the pilgrims, but adventurers, reinforce their faith, they experience warm hospitality, art, culture, tradition, and so on. So this is the public domain where if we will continue to surrender ourselves to this kind of fast bubble transport, we will not be able to remake our city. Next. Play. The way children have survived or trying to survive this pandemic is a lesson. In the most difficult time, what we are facing, they are the ones who have inspired us. They are the ones who are trying to forget these things by playing. The social isolation imposed by COVID-19 made it abundantly clear that we need others, not only of the same age group, but young and old, middle-aged, and the youth, which is carrying us forward. It is the synergy of us all, and it is learning to appreciate, watching children play. Playing should be extended beyond just reserved park. Playing can exist in any public domain. And the recent popularity of large sport facilities such as stadia and their even larger parking lots are worth questioning. Despite cities financially strapped, which are continuing to bet for these things, imagine what the city can be if we were to look at in post-pandemic period where all income, all age groups can participate. Next. Our consumer lifestyle is to be questioned and challenged. Waste that is generated by our consumer society threatens the environment and the climate. We are an integral part of global network. The contemporary relationship with waste built on the practice of removing it from one place to another, as if making it disappear is not sustainable. Waste could be a resource, material, monetary, and source of energy. It is also a social responsibility, like the other social responsibilities which we are talking about. It is so very important moving ahead to think about not just the issues, the amount of waste, I do not want to depress you more, generated trying to protect us from the COVID. The rubber gloves, the masks, the protective gears, they are starting to appear all across the coastlines. It is also that's responsibility that needs to be addressed. Next, recover, reuse, recycle, most of all, reduce. Recently, we did a project with the Inuit communities on the north, which tries to deal with the challenge of the physical waste that is generated in remote places. In remote places, this challenge has become very evident. And what we demonstrated is this resource can become a real vehicle for building our communities in a different and new way. Next. Gardening, urban gardening brings food production back in the fold of our city. We hear in post-pandemic discussion, local food, local value chains, supplying food farm to fork, and other activities. Let us change the traditional functional divide between the city, where city and rural areas operate in two spheres. Cities can become places of food production. On the top right-hand side, two images you see are from Kampala. Kampala was the first city in my global project that we directed that formally accepted urban agriculture and fishery as a land use. That remains the only city in the world that has done and achieved this thing. In upgrading of the slums and poor communities in Sri Lanka, the image of which we see on the top left, we had very limited spaces. Even in the most limited of the spaces, we were able to introduce medicinal and herbal food remedies so that it would improve the food insecurity, which we all are facing through post-pandemic. On just below that, on the left-hand side in the middle, you see the urban gardening programs of the city of Montreal, which we demonstrated in the publication you see on the bottom right-hand side, that is one of the biggest urban gardening program on allotments the size of 2 meters by 3 meters. People are able to produce their own food. We showed these things 10 years ago. The city of Montreal is talking a lot about improving the food systems and local food security. They have not added a single lot for growing food in this city, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. Rather, these allotments have shrunk in number and in sizes. Bottom left-hand is the image of the slum upgrading and integration of urban agriculture in the slums of Rosario. That city has achieved the greatest results, and this year, again, 10 years, today more than 10,000 families are participating in food production. Not only are they able to meet their food needs, they are able to produce extra food, and they are able to sell this in these areas. These 4 actions are not enough. Post-pandemic, if we want to think about the city, we will have to think about two other overarching concepts next. Multifunctionality. André Fleury, a well-known French agronomist, popularized this concept, which is well recognized in agriculture. In lay terms, it means benefits of agriculture beyond the basic food production and commerce. There are many: environmental protection, rural employment, landscape, lifestyle, food security, and so on. World Trade Organization has recognized this. Here I give you an example of how one can think multifunctionally in urban sense. Today, the city of Montreal has more than 100 kilometers of green lanes. The lanes which were service lanes in the city, community are taking over those lanes where we used to supply coal, wood, and other heating supplies, which are now not used anymore. And those sheds which were in the lanes where fire hazards, they have all been removed. These communities have taken over, and look at how children, every child that lives on that block has their little sign up there. There you have a little structure which you see in the bottom left is a hotel for small insects that is created by the individuals. In the middle, you see how play areas have. These spaces have become not only service areas to provide services to the residents, but give new meaning to urban green infrastructure. Lanes have become playgrounds. They have become safe havens for children, new places for urban gardening. They have emerged as urban lungs. Imagine creating 100 kilometers of laneways which are green. There is no municipality that can afford to maintain these areas. It's only citizens, only the local residents who will be able to turn around and maintain such huge lungs of the city. Next, and the final topic I would like to emphasize is temporality. The state of existing within or having some relationship with time in urban context is rather young. However, during the first wave of COVID, when hospitals were flooded with patients, many temporary facilities were set up in great variety of spaces and structure, even in tents. Fast forward to accommodate large number of clients to be vaccinated for a limited time, stadia, drive-in cinema, parks, convention center, shopping malls, even automobiles were converted into vaccination centers. However, these are adaptations of short duration. More long-term, even permanent, temporal and functional shifts and disturbances are desirable in urban spaces. They could be annual, they could be seasonal, they could be monthly, weekly, or even daily. If conceived carefully and in partnership with the residents, these changes can be enduring, enhance daily lives of ordinary people and community as a whole. Time can be used more ambitiously in recognizing, reprogramming the functional city. It can also become a long-term, even permanent transformative element. In Mexico City, the award-winning group, Laboratory para la Ciudad, an experimental of the local government, used time to recover play areas for children in the city, which has more than 2 million children. Since play spaces are unevenly distributed in the city, this was the most logical and least expensive way to find more equitable distribution of these areas and spaces. The city created play lanes. Other cities like Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia have followed the suit. So has Montreal. In my neighborhood, what you see here, the street has been converted into play area for children, terraces for restaurants to spill over. And this conversion will last all through the season now. And that has been accepted as the change of the land use happening every year. So the concepts of temporality, post-COVID, what we are already doing should be used. Time is money. However, in reimagining the city, remarkably, time is relatively inexpensive. What it requires is orchestration rather than resource. Time can be calibrated in utilizing and making cities better. Post-pandemic rethinking, the city's objective should be recognized that the change is born out of necessity, also pose ethical questions. Next. Great Orchestra of Montreal, Montreal Symphony Orchestra, has decided that they will be going from neighborhood to neighborhood, and the changes which are happening physically, they are performing not like street artists, but how these changes are really energizing the city is worth looking. Most of the orchestra halls are empty. Orchestra halls, when they were filled by old people. When will you imagine a child, younger people, new parents going to the symphony orchestra? Post-COVID, cities, institutions, and others are really engaging in thinking about it. We are searching for alternatives, not a new vision for the city. And in moving forward, remember the words of Nelson Mandela. The power of imagination created the illusion that my vision went much farther than the naked eyes could actually see. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vikram. A wonderful set of images with some extraordinary implications on the way we think about city design, actually. I think Professor Asako has joined us.
Oui, bien sûr, je suis avec vous.
Bonjour, monsieur le vice-recteur. J'espère que tout va bien. Est-ce que vous êtes prêt à commencer votre présentation?
Oui, je vais voir si ma connexion me le permet.
Oui, allez-y.
Je vais essayer de... Est-ce qu'on peut me permettre de partager mon écran?
Oui, oui, c'est possible. Allez-y. Le bouton vert au fond de l'écran.
Oui, parce qu'il me mentionne que vous ne pouvez pas démarrer le partage d'écran pendant qu'un autre participant partage. Donc, peut-être qu'il faudrait que le participant qui partage l'écran l'arrête pour l'instant.
OK, attends un instant. Michel, est-ce que c'est possible? Michel, is it possible to enable screen sharing for Professor Asako?
Oui, ça devrait marcher.
Okay,
Pouvez-vous réessayer, s'il vous plaît?
Je réessaye. Attendez.
Ah, voilà.
Je vois le partage. Ah, voilà.
Merci, Michel.
Là, je peux partager, mais je n'ai toujours pas... Attendez que j'y arrive.
Et voilà.
C'est bon?
Oui.
Attendez que je...
toute votre vie est exposée pour l'instant. Et voilà.
Alors, attendez que je prenne mon diaporama.
Oui, excellent, merci.
Bon, alors, bonjour, chers collègues. Je signale bien sûr que nous sommes là dans le cadre de la 4e conférence de ICCCASU qui se passe à Montréal, mais surtout en ligne. Et je vais vous entretenir sur le thème « La ville au centre des pandémies et risques sanitaires majeurs, enjeux, situations et perspectives ». Donc, j'ai organisé mon intervention qui ne sera pas longue en 4 points. Le premier point, c'est de parler des pandémies et la compromission que ces pandémies-là exercent sur le développement. Le deuxième point, c'est de dire pourquoi on doit tant se préoccuper de la ville quand il s'agit des pandémies. Le troisième point, c'est savoir quels acteurs impliqués, quelles actions menées dans la lutte contre ces pandémies et surtout de leurs conséquences. Et puis le quatrième point sera l'occasion d'examiner les questions que je qualifie de perspectives pour voir où est-ce qu'on va, comment est-ce qu'on le fait et pour quels résultats. Alors, si je prends le premier point, qui est donc de parler des pandémies dans la compromission du développement, je crois qu'il n'est pas superfétatoire de revenir sur la définition d'une pandémie. Et donc, une épidémie qui atteint un grand nombre de personnes dans une zone géographique très étendue. Et cela devient donc une endémie lorsque l'épidémie perdure, généralement au-delà d'1 an. Alors, ce qu'on doit bien retenir, c'est que la pandémie impacte durablement le développement. Parce que je voudrais que nous appréhendions le développement de façon différentielle. Parce que le Canada n'a pas les mêmes préoccupations que la Chine n'a pas les mêmes préoccupations que le Cameroun, qui non plus n'a pas les mêmes préoccupations que les États-Unis, par exemple. Donc, nous avons, en ce qui concerne les pays en développement, des préoccupations particulières qui font que une pandémie qui peut avoir des conséquences relativement limitées dans un pays puisse être plutôt catastrophique dans un autre pays. Donc, lorsque nous parlons des pandémies en ce qui concerne les pays en développement, l'Afrique en particulier, nous y apportons une attention particulière. Nous y avons des appréhensions spéciales qui peuvent être relativisées ailleurs. Pourquoi? Parce que la pandémie concerne un effectif de sujets relativement important. Donc, nous sommes ici dans des pays où la transition démographique n'a pas encore eu lieu partout, n'est peut-être même pas proche. Donc, on ne peut pas simplifier une question qui intéresse un grand nombre de sujets. Voilà pourquoi les pandémies sont des préoccupations de premier ordre dans les pays en développement. Le deuxième point dans cela, c'est la proportion des sujets atteints par rapport à la population totale. C'est très important. Parce que autant sur le plan purement quantitatif, on peut dire oui, il y a tel nombre de victimes qui sont concernées. Bon, mais lorsqu'on met cela en rapport avec la population totale, c'est là où on se rend compte que beaucoup plus que dans les pays actuellement développés, les pays en développement doivent traiter avec un maximum de sérieux toute question de santé publique. Pire encore quand il s'agit des pandémies. L'autre problème, c'est la classe d'âge visée. Vous avez vu, en ce qui concerne vraiment la pandémie de la COVID, là où les ravages étaient exceptionnellement importants, je pense à l'Italie, à la France, aux États-Unis, à la Chine, la classe d'âge visée, c'était essentiellement le grand âge, le troisième âge, si on peut dire, qui s'est avéré être la classe d'âge la plus exposée, qui a eu le plus de victimes jusqu'à l'heure actuelle. Bon, mais pour que vous voyez encore la différence avec les pays en développement, il se trouve que cette classe d'âge-là, dans les pays occidentaux développés, concerne une population qui relativement n'est plus une population active au sens professionnel du terme. Ça veut dire quoi? Ça veut dire que en ce qui concerne l'Afrique maintenant, si on considère une pandémie qui concerne beaucoup plus une classe d'âge moyenne ou jeune, ça veut dire qu'il y a des possibilités de compromettre durablement et beaucoup plus durement les économies. C'est pour ça que la notion de classe d'âge intervient ici pour en fait voir comment les pandémies peuvent négativement influencer le développement économique. Et puis, quatrièmement, c'est les catégories socio-professionnelles. Parce que vous savez qu'il y a des pandémies qui sont liées soit à l'activité professionnelle, soit alors qu'elles peuvent viser des catégories particulières. Bon, mais ce qu'on voit en ce qui concerne la pandémie du corona, par exemple, c'est que je pense que le danger est venu du fait que ce sont les personnels soignants qui ont été les plus exposés. Parce que recevant un grand nombre de patients dans des conditions pas toujours adéquates, parce que les États ne se sont pas toujours préparés à affronter une pandémie comme celle que nous vivons en ce moment. Donc, alors, ce qui est encore plus dramatique, c'est que ce sont ces personnels soignants qui doivent s'occuper des malades qui eux-mêmes ont été parmi les premières victimes. Et cela a été valable dans tous les pays, on l'a vu, au point où il a parfois été question de transfert de personnel soignant d'un pays à un autre. Voilà pourquoi il m'a semblé nécessaire de revenir sur ces notions relativement simples, je dirais même simplistes, pour comprendre à quel point les pandémies impactent durablement le développement des pays. Bon, maintenant, ce que je dis des pays, il faut bien qu'on se comprenne, c'est que, et là c'est le deuxième volet, c'est que la pandémie impacte les structures et mécanismes de production des richesses. Je le dis pourquoi? Je le dis parce que quand bien même on serait dans des pays actuellement développés, la production des richesses doit être un mécanisme continu, un mécanisme continuel. Parce que s'il y a rupture de production des richesses à un moment, cela peut compromettre parfois l'existence des pays tout entiers. Donc, il faut arriver à maintenir la production des richesses. Et c'est à ce moment-là qu'on se rend bien compte que la survenance des pandémies est quelque chose d'absolument néfaste. Pourquoi? Parce que les pandémies incapacitent les acteurs y afférents, ce qui est normal. Une personne qui n'est pas en santé ne peut pas produire, elle ne peut même pas aller au travail, elle ne se sent pas bien, ainsi de suite. Donc, dès l'instant qu'il y a des pandémies, cela incapacite les acteurs. Les pandémies entraînent l'immobilisation et même, je peux dire, le détournement des acteurs vers les soins à apporter aux victimes. Donc, c'est toute cette immobilisation-là qui entraîne donc la stagnation des économies. Parce que ce qu'on doit bien se dire, ça je vais l'expliquer après le troisième point de ce deuxième volet, à savoir que les pandémies entraînent le détournement des moyens financiers, matériels et humains, et même institutionnels. Quand je parle de détournement, ce n'est pas au sens de la malveillance, hein, c'est au sens où les moyens financiers, matériels, humains et institutionnels que les États auraient dû utiliser pour maintenir le développement, pour ceux qui l'ont déjà atteint, ou alors pour impulser le développement, et bien ces moyens-là seront réorientés. C'est pour ça que je parle de détournement, seront réorientés dans le sens du, enfin, ou divertis, au sens latin de divertere, qui veut dire détourner. Bon, alors, donc ces moyens, au lieu de servir au maintien du développement, à la production des richesses et des biens, à la production des services, eh bien, ces moyens seront réorientés vers la recherche de la santé. Bon, la conséquence immédiate, c'est que ce qu'on va observer, c'est que 2020, 2021, peut-être même plus loin encore, on va assister à des récessions économiques planétaires, au niveau planétaire, à cause justement de cet impact de la pandémie sur les mécanismes de production. Bon, avec ceci de particulier que la pandémie de la COVID, c'est un accident dans l'histoire, et comme c'est un accident, ça veut dire que d'autres accidents sont possibles. La preuve, en restant que dans la COVID, il y a déjà des mutations du virus. Donc, on n'est jamais à l'abri, puisqu'il s'agit d'un accident, on n'est jamais à l'abri d'un accident supplémentaire, tout en sachant que nous traînons, avant l'arrivée de la COVID, d'autres pandémies qui ne se sont pas estompées parce que la COVID est arrivée. Vous avez le VIH-Sida qui est planétaire, vous avez des situations dans les milieux tropicaux où nous nous trouvons, nous avons le paludisme de façon endémique, il y a la typhoïde, il y a des tas de situations comme ça auxquelles la COVID est venue s'ajouter, sans que nous soyons à l'abri de la survenance d'un autre accident. Voilà pourquoi il faut vraiment traiter cette affaire de pandémie de façon holistique. Le troisième volet, c'est que la COVID brise les chaînes de la socialisation. J'ai bien aimé l'intervention de celui qui m'a précédé. Pourquoi? Parce que le problème de la COVID, c'est qu'elle est venue briser les liens interpersonnels. Alors, on parle de distanciation corporelle. On parle de distanciation médicale. Si je m'arrête d'abord à la distanciation corporelle, vous imaginez toute cette chaîne de chaleur humaine, de relations, de communion qui est brisée. Les cafés sont vides, les rues sont vides, les grandes rencontres de loisirs, de football, de sport et tout ça ne payent plus de mine. Pourquoi? Parce qu'il y a, au meilleur des cas, distanciation corporelle et au pire des cas, interdiction absolue de communion. Donc, vous voyez que, contrairement à d'autres pandémies où la contamination n'a pas forcément besoin comment je vais dire, du relationnel, la COVID est venue briser les chaînes de la socialisation.
Professeur Sosako,
Oui.
je vais me permettre d'intervenir parce que
Oui.
vous dépassez grandement le temps alloué. C'est extrêmement intéressant, mais est-ce qu'on pourrait vous demander, c'est parce qu'on ne veut pas perdre vos perspectives, votre dernière slide. Alors, si vous pouviez conclure dans 4 ou 5 minutes, ce serait bien apprécié.
D'accord. Vous savez, c'est des choses dont on parle avec tellement de passion qu'on ne voit pas le temps passer, madame.
Absolument.
Bon, alors, je disais que pourquoi tout ça est important comme pour l'urbaniste que je suis? Regardez un peu le slide que je vous montre là. Regardez vous-même, messieurs et dames, chers collègues, depuis le Canada où vous êtes et depuis partout dans le monde. Regardez les pourcentages de population urbaine dans le monde. Alors, qu'est-ce que cette carte nous montre? Alors, cette carte nous montre que le monde s'est urbanisé. Le monde s'est tellement urbanisé que presque tout le monde vit en ville. Ça veut donc dire que dès l'instant qu'on a une pandémie comme celle qui est le cas ici, eh bien, les toutes premières cibles qu'on va identifier, c'est dans les villes. Parce que les villes sont des lieux de communion, des lieux de communion, comme je l'ai dit. Donc, dès l'instant qu'une pandémie vient pour casser ce brassage de population, eh bien, ça devient quelque chose de catastrophique. Pour le slide que je viens de montrer, vous voyez que, évidemment, les villes sont des lieux de brassage multiforme de population, les lieux de transit de population, parce qu'on a tendance à l'oublier, les gares routières, les gares ferroviaires, les aéroports. Les villes sont des hauts lieux de brassage de population avec le transport en commun, la production des biens et des services, etc. Donc, la conséquence logique est donc que les villes ont été et sont encore les plus grands foyers de transmission de COVID et donc de pertes en vies humaines liées à la pandémie. Et c'est pour ça que les villes mériteraient donc d'avoir les meilleures mesures possibles pour prévenir cela. Alors, quels acteurs impliqués, quelles actions et pour quels résultats? Voilà ce que je dis donc en termes, peut-être pas la conclusion, mais moins en termes de perspective, c'est qu'il faudrait, j'ai divisé ça en 3 colonnes. Première colonne, les acteurs qu'il faut identifier, ou bien les secteurs qu'il faut identifier, puis maintenant les actions qu'il faut mener, et en 4, les attentes éventuelles. Bon, en ce qui concerne les acteurs, je vais aller par ligne. J'invite le législatif. J'interroge le législatif. C'est-à-dire qu'il faut légiférer davantage en matière urbanistique, c'est-à-dire en tenant compte maintenant de la situation sanitaire. Il faut de la législation au niveau sanitaire, il faut une bonne articulation avec l'international. Pourquoi? Parce qu'il n'y a plus en ce moment des problèmes particuliers. Il n'y a pas de problème sectoriel. Il n'y a pas de problème qui ne concerne qu'un pays et qui ne puisse pas concerner un autre. Dans le cas de la COVID dont nous avons la situation en ce moment, eh bien, ça a commencé à un endroit précis avant d'atteindre le monde entier en quelques mois seulement, à partir d'un seul point. Donc, on ne peut plus imaginer maintenant une législation qui se limite simplement à un endroit. La deuxième chose, le deuxième acteur, c'est l'exécutif dans tous les pays, en termes de réglementation urbanistique, en termes de réglementation sanitaire. Pour quelle attente? L'attente ici, c'est que l'aménagement du territoire doit de plus en plus relever d'un cadrage résidentiel plus sain. Il faut que les résidences soient beaucoup plus saines pour éviter que d'autres pandémies ne surviennent et ne s'ajoutent à celles que nous avons maintenant. Troisième acteur, c'est les milieux sanitaires. Pourquoi j'indexe les milieux sanitaires comme un des acteurs clés de la mesure? C'est qu'il faut apporter un soin particulier aux soins curatifs. Parce que ce qui est important, ce qui est particulier avec les pandémies, c'est que les gens sont malades d'abord. Les gens sont malades, ils attrapent la maladie, ils sont malades. Il faut qu'on les soigne d'abord. Il faut qu'on soigne ceux qui sont déjà malades. Mais à côté de ça, il y a des soins préventifs. C'est justement dans ce sens qu'on peut comprendre cette campagne planétaire de vaccination qui a lieu partout, malgré quelques réticences à gauche, à droite, des réticences d'ailleurs, qui sont peut-être parfois justifiées parce que les gens ont besoin d'être rassurés. On a besoin de savoir qu'on ne va pas plutôt contracter la maladie en essayant d'éviter de l'avoir. Donc, alors, la formation, oui.
Oui, je suis désolée, je vais intervenir encore parce que le temps file et on voudrait avoir du temps de discussion. Et je sais que votre dernier point est très important parce qu'il porte beaucoup sur les perspectives. Est-ce que je pourrais vous demander de sauter à votre dernière diapo sur les perspectives?
OK,
je suis désolée.
Je suis sur les perspectives. Je suis sur les perspectives, madame. J'en vois 4. La première perspective, c'est de dire non à la distanciation définitive et redonner son âme à la ville. On ne peut pas imaginer des villes à distanciation personnelle définitive. Ça veut dire que les villes sont mortes. La ville, c'est aussi un lieu de flânerie, un lieu de romance, un lieu de loisirs, un lieu de production des biens et des services. Donc, si on imagine des villes où la distanciation doit devenir absolument définitive, ça veut dire que les villes vont cesser d'exister. Deuxième perspective, c'est de pouvoir capitaliser toutes les opportunités de soins, aussi bien curatives que préventives. Parce que le dommage qu'on a eu, d'ailleurs depuis le début de la pandémie, c'était de dire tel traitement est bien, tel autre ne l'est pas. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'on veut? On veut le traitement, on veut la personne qui donne le traitement ou bien on veut le résultat, c'est-à-dire le soin, c'est-à-dire de recouvrer la santé. Donc, je pense qu'on doit aller maintenant dans une approche beaucoup plus holistique qui capitalise donc toutes les opportunités de soins qui se présentent. Troisième perspective, c'est de capitaliser la pharmacopée, de convoquer la spiritualité négro-africaine en valorisant la transcendance. Je m'explique. L'Afrique noire dispose d'une très riche pharmacopée et d'une capacité de valorisation de la spiritualité qui nous a sorti de bien de problèmes. Regardez, l'Organisation mondiale de la santé avait prévu des hécatombes incommensurables pour l'Afrique en rapport avec la COVID-19. Mais tout le monde est surpris de voir que l'Afrique a relativement bien résisté. Ce n'est pas pour rien, madame. C'est parce qu'il y a, enfin, messieurs et dames, c'est parce qu'il y a en Afrique une pharmacopée efficiente, pertinente, qui a ses effets. Parce qu'il y a en Afrique une gestion de la spiritualité, de la transcendance, qui ne demande qu'à être reconnue et à être valorisée. Alors, le dernier point dans mes aspects, dans mes perspectives, c'est de dire qu'il faut rester prudent et ne pas parler trop vite de post-pandémie. Nous devons rester prudents. Malgré les efforts que nous faisons les uns et les autres pour trouver les remèdes, pour trouver des vaccins, pour trouver des remèdes, y compris dans la pharmacopée, y compris dans la spiritualité africaine dont je parle, eh bien, nous devons quand même rester prudents parce qu'on n'est jamais trop sûr de comment le virus peut évoluer, de quelle association il peut avoir avec d'autres pandémies, de quels autres accidents sanitaires peuvent intervenir pendant que nous traitons de la COVID. Voilà, messieurs et dames, depuis Douala, au Cameroun, ce que je devais dire dans le cadre de cette conférence internationale. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, professeur. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
Maintenant, je suis à vous.
Merci beaucoup, professeur Asako. Vous avez soulevé une bonne série de points soulignés par nos collègues, Mary Rowe et Vikram Bhatt, et j'apprécie surtout l'observation qu'on doit rester prudent et ne pas parler trop vite du post-pandémie. C'est très vrai. Merci beaucoup. John Zachariah, it's your turn now. You have 1.5 minutes. Can you,
Yeah,
can you
thank
compress?
you. I will try to make this, can you hear me? I'll try to make this really brief. I won't have any images.
John, take all the time you need. We can run an extra 15 minutes for the Q&A. So please go ahead.
I don't have any images. I thought I would rely on your good imaginations to know what I am talking about here this morning. So I wanted to place the pandemic, the current pandemic, in the context of public health, and in particular with regard to the rise in non-communicable diseases. And there, I think you all know what I'm talking about: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, osteoporosis, obesity, Alzheimer's disease. I've probably missed a few, but it's a lot of non-communicable diseases that the medical authorities around the world are also very concerned about. So only about 2 weeks ago, we heard from the World Health Organization that for every death directly related to COVID-19, there were about 2, or estimated to be about 2 deaths related to comorbidities. What we're talking about in the comorbidities are those non-communicable diseases. So if I take the World Health Organization's data as my starting point, I would say the biggest health crisis we have to deal with here is the public health crisis. Because the viruses are coming at increasing frequency over the last century and are predicted to come back to us in the future at increasing frequency. That is what the virologists are telling us. So we have to prepare for that, and that means making our populations more resilient. And how do we make them more resilient? Well, there has been, over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of research on motivation therapy and incentivization, getting people to be more physically active in their daily lives. So as a lot of research money has gone into that, and there's a lot of published reports that you can read, and the effects are there. But the effects, let me just generalize, are on the order of single-digit percentage improvements in physical activity. That's what we've got, and they are sustained in a minority of the studies after the interventions are stopped. So while we don't want to say that it doesn't work, and we need to do that, obviously, it's not going to address the public health crisis that is at our doorstep, and which is going to grow as the population ages. If I just say this with regard to China now, so China has estimated some 88 million obese cases. That's the most in the world, but as a proportion of the population, it's smaller than the United States and some other countries. But the obesity rates are rising right around the world, and they're increasing also in developing countries, and it increases more rapidly actually than is the rate of economic development in those countries. Yes, it's related to urbanization, but the urbanization has brought us into this sedentary lifestyle and diminishing public activity. What we do know is that interventions in the environment to promote walkability and cyclability and non-motorized transportation and so on are effective. They are effective, and more than in the single digits percentage improvements in physical activity. You can get quite big improvements. However, they are very localized. And what we have in a lot of cities is spot developments. Right outside the conference venue here in Montreal, you have a pedestrianized street, and we're all happy to see that, and we think it's a game changer. It's not. It's a minor intervention in the physical environment when the larger environment hasn't really been touched. And as the city continues to expand, if I talk about Montreal or I talk about Beijing, in fact, the city continues to expand and sedentariness is constantly increasing. So in the case of Beijing, so I thought that the development in the 1980s was quite effective. You know that in 1986 in Beijing, more than 60% of the population was commuting to work on a bicycle. And the city was organized to support that kind of non-motorized transportation. In 1994, China declared the automotive industry as a pillar industry of the economy. And cities got on board to restructure their infrastructure, and especially the road infrastructure. The city of Beijing, to begin with its ring road system and very large arterials across the city, essentially to support motorization. So today in Beijing, there are something like 7 million cars. About 6 of them are privately registered. 6 million of them are privately registered. That's a lot of cars in the city. And then, so it's they're traveling on this road infrastructure, which is, in my view, overbuilt. But the good thing about that they actually did this starting in 1994 is that we now have a space resource, which we didn't have before. We have an amazing space resource. So I look at the fourth ring road in Beijing is 85 meters across, building wall to building wall, 85 meters. The secondary arterials are 70 meters across. Now, just for scale of comparison here, l'Avenue des Champs-Élysées in Paris is 70 meters across. This is an enormous space. So in the case of the fourth ring road, we're talking about 12 or 14 lanes. If we look at the traffic on those roads, I mentioned yesterday to David that in Beijing, it is estimated that 30% of the road traffic is logistics. That's us ordering through Taobao, Alibaba, Meituan, and the other delivery services to bring food to our doorstep and everything else that we need to our doorstep, so we never need to go outside. And we continue to use now all these electronic media to even reduce further our physical activity. So we're not improving things at all. And I was trained as an urban planner. Was I concerned about public health, or was my school concerned with public health when I was learning? Not really. We didn't hear about it. We heard about how to make the city efficient, how to get from one place to another more quickly and with less energy expenditure. What we've done all these years as urban planners is try to reduce our energy expenditure, presuming that that brings convenience and comfort. Yeah, but it's killing us is the problem. So we need to transform this environment. If I go back to that road infrastructure in Beijing and I look at that 30% logistic traffic, and then another figure, if you can stand this, more than 50% of the commuting trips by car in central Beijing within 5 ring roads, more than 50% are for less than 5 kilometers. So people are getting in their cars to drive to work, and it's less than 5 kilometers. 5 kilometer ride on a bicycle is not very far, especially in a flat city. And then you diminish that by other unnecessary trips like to shopping centers and so on. You're left with an essential road-based vehicle traffic of something like 10%. 10% of what is there now. Well, what does that mean in road infrastructure? That fourth ring road with 12, 14, and in some places 16 lanes can be reduced to 4 lanes. And other streets in the secondary arterials reduced to 2 lanes. Well, we have an enormous space resource. It should be restructured totally for recreation, leisure activities, non-motorized transportation, and surface transport, surface public transport. The metro is all well and good, but it's good for long distance travel. And it really isn't good for short distance travel at all. So that's what I'm trying to make this really brief so we can have a bit of a debate about this. It's a radical proposal. And I do think the good thing is that China made this move, but for the wrong purposes. But now they have the resource, and those amazing street resources need to be completely restructured to enable us to regain our physical health, to prepare us for the next things that will come along that we don't know when they're coming, but they're coming. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for this provoking final comment. And thank you to all our panelists for their stimulating presentation. We are already into a conversation, and now we want to invite people in the audience to intervene. There were a lot of common points between all of you. I guess the modern city that Vikram talked about is not the way forward. We're all looking at community space, the importance of what we call public space, but maybe it's community space also. So a lot of common themes between you. And I guess we would like to hear from the audience that may have other experience to enrich this point of view or even confront this point of view. So people, I would ask you to either raise your hand and intervene directly online by activating your video camera. Otherwise, you can send your comments and question in the chat or in the Q&A. But please, in the chat, make sure that you address your question to everyone and not just to the panel so that everyone can see what your comment is and your question. But we would like more to see you live online. So questions? And in the meantime, if the panelists want to exchange, just go ahead.
Can I quickly follow up while the audience is thinking about issues that they want to bring up? I want to follow up on something John just referred to. You know, we've seen a remarkable number of themes already in the first 2 days of the conference. You know, the city as an incubator, for example, comes up again and again. The improvisational nature of the interventions that many of you have referred to. Mary Rowe referred to the issue of governance structures, by implication, the role of professionals. Vikram showed us a number of very compelling improvisational interventions in and around Montreal on the main streets and in the back lanes. And Professor Asako talked about actors' roles. And John, you referred, and you were the only one, I think, in the sessions that I've attended yesterday and this morning so far, that actually talked about the education of professionals. What you said was that nothing in your professional education prepared you for the kind of decisions that what the Canadian Urban Institute would call city builders have to deal with now. None of us, in fact, none of our professional educations prepared us for the issues that are the main subject of these 4 days of discussions. So do any of you have any thoughts about the implications, for example, on professional education, beyond the obvious ones, about the importance of transdisciplinary thinking about many of these issues? So that might be one way to get the conversation going. Any thoughts?
Just a gazillion impediments to doing this, right? Because everybody is siloed, municipal governments are siloed.
Yes.
Professional disciplines have a certain kind of limited scope that and then those that are more experimental and want to make their scope broader then get criticized by colleagues who feel that they're moving in. So I think that this is where I'm just a fundamental subsidiaritist. I'm going to turn that into a noun. Do you like that? I feel like I have to make the case here that we have to, when in doubt, decentralize, when in doubt, devolve. And because I don't know how else you're going to get it. If you think of planning decisions, for instance, that are often taken very remotely, they at the best, they're taken at maybe a district level, a neighborhood district level, but more likely they're taken at a municipal level by some bureaucrat buried in a city hall somewhere, or worse, they bump up another level to a jurisdiction, a state or a provincial jurisdiction, which is so removed from the particularities of those neighborhoods. So, this is why I'm suggesting that I feel like one of the only, for me, at this stage of my life, the only way I can kind of calm my own cognitive dissonance around this is to just focus on local and on place-based initiatives that are rooted in the reality of the street or the neighborhood. And I feel like COVID compelled us to do this. you know, we had to figure out, we couldn't move very far. So, and so then you start to think, I mean, it creates this whole discourse about the 15-minute city. And I'm not suggesting, I'm not sure I'm sold on the 15-minute city, because I'm not sure that won't end up just giving us another bunch of messes that big planning concepts have done in the past. And we would create enclaves and things like that. You know, you want to have porous neighborhoods, you want to have lots of going and back and flowing. But I feel like we need to turn things, I need a prop that I don't have, to turn things on its side, to look at what local democracy really needs to look like. And maybe, and not just because of the rights piece of that, or that we feel that local democracy is hinging on that level of engagement. It's also just that you get better solutions, you get more practical solutions, you waste less money, and you find different kinds of improvisations that are very effective and often much cheaper than some kind of centrally controlled thing. So I'd be interested to know what my colleagues think, because you have a perspective that's an international one. And we know that in the Global South, this happens all the time because resources are scarce. And so there's tons of improvisation, tons of different kinds of informal ways of addressing this. And I wish that the Global North would get with the program on this and not be so afraid of it.
I would like to question this definitional silos a little bit. Formal, informal, local, and the boundaries of different institutions and individuals. This is, I think, very important to understand, that what is the public domain is also a private domain, and it is the fluidity of this. So rather than what John raised is a very, very important question. What is the public domain that is created because of a certain kind of historical event in the city where we have individualized bubble transport, but it was a similar situation when the walls were built around Beijing, the original walls, which the post-revolution, there were proposals to create into a linear park. You're putting forward something very profound. Automobile is a very young object in history of a city, which is 5,000 years old. It's 100 years old. Suddenly, if you take that perspective, who controls what, and what an individual or community does, it is not informal. If we formal authorities or advisors advise in a certain way, my experience in teaching to students tells me, if I ask a student to design 5 variations of a house, that's the limit of an individual who will be able to create different designs. But when 20 people are working on it, the designs which come out are 20 times more varied, even though they're working on the same thing. So that participation of individuals, it's the leaving of the room, and these boundaries are shifting. This is what is the very unique historical point we are at, where push and pull of these domains allows us to think more fluidly. And that's where I say, if we want the formal authorities to work within a more structured way, John is saying, question the modes. What I'm trying to suggest is perhaps think of time and functionalities, which we thought in a very classic way, corrupt the system. If you see something with something else, allows us you to do things. What you're talking about, Mary, it's exactly the same from the grassroots point of view. So this is, I think, coming together in a very way. And Asako also was talking about very similar ideas, but in a different domain, in different geographical space.
I was just going to pick up on Mary's point with, you know, local communities. I did some studies with on, I guess not with, but on local communities who were pushing back against motorization. So it's not as though everyone wants to get on board with the new technologies. Okay, so they did, but you know, they regarded us urban planners. I was just acting as a researcher, not as an urban planner, but I was quickly identified as an urban planner. They saw us as the enemy. They saw us as a branch of the government imposing our vision on them. And, you know, they were left without any real technical support. So how do we help them is the thing. And do we throw away all the, you know, the baggage that we have from our training and experience and try to see it from their perspective? Really, I'm struggling with this because those local communities have every right to live in a space that is convenient and good for them, especially good for their health. They pushed back against this, but with great difficulty because they didn't know quite how to do it physically. I mean, in a physical intervention sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Again, people from the audience, you are very welcome to jump in the conversation.
We have a question from Nancy Bolima. Shall I read it?
Yes, please.
I'll read it. Communities are at the center of COVID-19 response, she writes. In the context of the theme for this conference, how will community space be brought into building resilience in public health crises and urbanization of cities in a sustainable manner? Community voice, community say. I think that's very consistent with the way the discussion is going. Nice question. Who wants to pick it up? Mary, you're muted, Mary.
Sorry, I'll just say at the outset, I think we need to look at informal mechanisms. I've just become a big champion of informal stuff or ad hoc, because I think that, well, we all know this. If it gets too formalized, it becomes unbelievably bureaucratic and layered. The risk is if it's informal that you're going to exclude people, that you won't be taken, you know, you won't be listened to, all that stuff. But I feel strongly that the way that we really sustain these things is by being nimble and creating. My other tip on this is, I think these initiatives, these kind of community sourcing initiatives need to be very focused on particular challenge, particular project, particular task. I think standing groups are hard to sustain and they lose their focus so quickly, and the world changes. So my view is that we have a kind of, we have to inculcate, and you guys have to teach your students to get their heads around being receptive to different kinds of input, different sources of engagement, different methods of engagement, and different ways to interpret information, so that, you know, increasingly regular folk, residents, are going to have better data than bureaucrats have.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it's always been true anecdotally. We've always had better anecdotal evidence. We've all got stories of you know, guys that, you know, that had better, I participated in a public hearing years ago where a farmer had gone into his own land basically and done his own core samples because he got sick and tired of the hydrogeologist telling him what his land was. And he pulled his own core samples and put it in front of the court and said, you see what I mean? I've got clay. And so we've all got anecdotes like that, but this is true in real time now. That, I mean, we all have it happen. People arrive at meetings and they've got scads and scads of data because they've been up all night with their 17-year-old, you know, doing some kind of level of analysis that would have taken 16 people in 9 months to get done 10 years ago. So I think we've got to be much more open to that kind, and I think tech's going to force us to be much more open to different kinds of informal, project-specific, problem-specific engagement.
And what's the role of the municipality or the local municipality?
Make room.
Yes, yeah. In the well, physical room and kind of ideological space.
And maybe provide some resources.
Yeah.
You know, provide meeting space, certainly, but provide technical resources, provide ubiquitous internet, provide some kind of actual community support resources. You know, we've done this for years. You know, we've done this. We just have to now do it a little more broadly.
And provide a voice.
Yeah.
Recognize the voice, for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question.
But the local authorities are still very much swayed by big business controls. And I can speak about who controls the public domain and use of this public domain. For example, big commerce is moving in very effectively in production of local food in a very powerful way. Grocery chains are now not only facilitating growing of food and selling of plants and so on, they are getting so ambitious in the production that they themselves are going to cut out local farmers in the network. So this evolutionary change which is happening is very positive on one side, but on the other side, how do we, in the managing of the city, negotiate these interests is very important to bear in mind. We're talking of informal or individual and local. At the same time, businesses are also very powerful partners in this process, but they also have to be brought in much more equitable way in certain regards. And this is very important to recognize.
Mary, we're going to ask, Denise is going to ask you all to take a moment to share a final thought or a final conclusion in a minute or two. I wonder if I could come back to an issue that you and many others have raised in the last 2 days, which has to do with the inappropriateness of the governance structures that we live with now. So how do you see that? What kind of a process do we need to change that? It will be a revolution, I think.
Yeah. Well, this is the dilemma. You know, you're either a fan of relentless incrementalism, or you feel that you've got to just burn down the house. You know, it's very complicated, and you're in Quebec, so you appreciate right now vividly in a way that Canadians and other places don't. We have different kinds of historical relationships, and we have different kinds of patterns that have evolved over time. I am less a fan. I mean, I think constitutions should be living documents, but they're not. And so I think, it's interesting. I have my peer who runs the US League of Cities. Canadians spend tons of time saying, oh, if only we had a strong mayor system, if only we had they're full of envy, thinking somehow American cities are that much better off. And my colleague there said, Mary, every mayor and every community leader in every American city wakes up every morning and thinks about what their new workaround is going to be that day. So, we're constantly having to live under these archaic arrangements that inhibit our capacity to have agency. But I would say that this federal government, for instance, is becoming quite creative in how to get resources in the hands of communities, because a lot of its goals can only be achieved in urban environments, in dense urban environments. It's climate goals, it's poverty goals, it's housing goals. And so you need municipal governments to be your partner in implementing those and in coming up with whatever those solutions are. We're not going to solve the climate crisis if we don't engage the most local levels of orders of government and then all the community layers that live underneath them. We're just not going to do it. So it's not by fiat that we're going to accomplish these things. So I think there's this, again, it's more of a understanding a more complex web understanding of governance, and that governance can take various forms. So even if you look at corrections in the oil sector, for instance, around oil and gas, that's happening in Alberta because there are coalitions of industry and environment and special interest groups and community groups and local governments and the provincial governments and other federal advocates that, that kind of mesh of tackling these challenges is what's needed. And I would say that at the local level, we're better in that we have more robust networks, but what you don't want to have happen is that you get immobilized. And I think that's part of the challenge. If you think for housing, for instance, it's very, very difficult. One of the sort of cynical things coming out of COVID, and I'm not sure how we're going to grapple with this, is that a lot of things that really have been advocated for and were the right things to do were completely stalled in municipal bureaucracies for years. And then COVID happens and shit, we get the bike lane. Oh, we get and I just want to go back on Vikram's point about public and private space. I look at my street now, which I live on Queen Street East in the East End of Toronto, and East End of downtown, I guess is where I am. And it's been completely appropriated by restaurant patios. It's fantastic. It's like Venice, for crying out loud. It is fantastic. I don't ever want us to lose it. And that means private business is operating in the street. I'm sitting there having a lovely glass of Chardonnay. It's not true because I don't drink, but I don't drink Chardonnay, but you know, I could be sitting there sipping away, sitting in the parking lane. So this is back to ad hoc, informal, mesh, and recognizing that the best answers come out of that kind of mix.
Yes.
Okay.
And that is where I think the fluidity of business, if you don't want to own a car,
Yes.
you perhaps will have to rely on Ubers or smart car or whatever the other transfer which may be happening. It is not, and that will have very strong liaison with the climate impacts. Everyone wants to talk of electric cars, but still it's a big volume that we are creating of CO2. Whether it's putting some other gas in it. So there you have it, this reduced ownership or distributed ownership or limited use. This is going to have an amazing impact if we are resilient enough. And this is what is not limited to only wealthy cities and wealthy countries.
Yeah.
This is what I have learned working with mayors of Rosario, where suddenly they say the public domain, which is there, where people, those who are growing things, can it become a marketplace for them to market things? And the city decides that right in the front of the city hall, the plaza, which is one of the most prestigious plaza of the city, should be twice a week allocated to create a market where poorest of the poor can come in. City helps set up their markets. They set up their stalls and they sell to the wealthy people. These connections which are happening in this process are, I am very hopeful that will not be limited, or it is not only in wealthy cities, and development means only money. Development means this recognition that there is equity which is to be established across many levels of urban development. And moving up, this is very, very critical to think through. And I can go on with different levels of example that we have found.
I believe we could go on forever discussing this. We're all very enthusiastic.
Just one other thing about the governance. Governance is not only municipal. Institutions and businesses also are stepping up and participating in this process. How schools are thinking about themselves of transforming, how universities are thinking about transforming themselves, and how even businesses. So it is this synergy that I think has to be tapped.
Okay, if we want to give 10 minutes to people to go to the next session, I would ask you to conclude in 1 minute. And Professor Asako has raised his hand, so maybe I could give him the first question, the first comment. be extremely short on this last comment. Professor Asako, you can open your micro. Vous pouvez ouvrir votre micro. Ouvrez votre micro.
En fait, je voulais dire que je ne vous entendais plus. Je ne sais pas si vous m'entendez.
Oui, on vous entend.
Oui,
Eh ben, moi, je vous entendais plus, je ne me voyais plus, je ne voyais plus rien.
Ah.
On a eu un petit souci de réseau.
Ah.
Donc, ce n'était pas une question en tant que telle, c'était pour signaler que je vous avais perdu en ligne.
Dommage.
Maintenant,
Alors,
ça va.
Nos panélistes vont conclure maintenant, donc il faut vraiment laisser aller la session maintenant.
D'accord.
Please, short comment. John?
John, you're muted.
Okay, just on the point of governance, I think that we need both top-down and bottom-up approaches. We haven't figured out how to do that yet. But in order to transform the city, as I have suggested we need to do for the purposes of public health, this does require some top-down policies. But we haven't figured out how to do that and combine that with local community initiatives. So that's really what I'd like to look at in the next few years, maybe. Thank you.
I mean, one way to do that is to do a human rights approach, which is what some advocates are talking about, a human right, which works both top down, bottom up, right? It gives you a frame. It gives the reassurance that people need that you're not creating uneven landscapes across the country, that the entitlements are the same, but it allows for that local innovation and how you get there.
Vikram?
Muted. Muted, Vikram. Vikram, you're muted.
Top down, bottom up, I feel is still too binary. We have constantly going and living through these binary relationships. The situation has made it quite very clear that you yourself mentioned that there is a possibility to allow other inputs and participations from different sources. The challenge is how do we bring it in? We will have to, we are going to wing it. I don't know. That's not the most positive way to move about. So the way I look at it is, first and foremost, generational, different age groups, how we bring them together. That we have remained separate. The COVID has made it very evident that what we have accepted, the majority of people who died were elderly, and suddenly we see if the society is working in an amazing way. When the vaccine rollout came out, nobody said, boo, the oldest people should get the first vaccine everywhere in the world. So there is this movement which is happening, which says that somehow we are starting to become more a family. This is what is more of a dialogue. How do we expand that dialogue into other? It's much more philosophical, but I think the time has come where we should be reaching out to the schools and educational institutions, community centers, and old age homes, where all these connections can somehow be strengthened in the best possible way.
I think we have to wrap up.
Yes, maybe a last word from Professor Asako, very short word.
Alors, ce que moi je peux dire pour conclure, c'est que nous devons tout faire pour conserver à la ville sa mission essentielle de mixité, sa mission essentielle de communion